I made a startling discovery in my wife's bag that almost destroyed our marriage. The moment I found them together, everything changed. Linda, my wife of 10 years, welcomed me home from work that Wednesday evening as usual. But instead of our usual chit-chat, she asked me to sit down, saying there was something serious we needed to discuss. Here we go again, I thought, bracing myself for another heavy conversation as I sat down. Once I was settled, Linda started off by telling me how much she loved me and how deeply committed she was to our marriage. For some reason, though, her words didn't calm me. They had the opposite effect, making me uneasy. I replied with a hesitant, "All right." But before I could say anything else, she cut me off with a deep breath and went straight to the point. "I love you," she began, "and I see us growing old together, but I've decided I want to have an affair." I was absolutely floored. The shock hit me hard, and I couldn't quite wrap my head around what she was saying. Struggling to make sense of it, I asked, "Wait, so you love me, you don't want to mess up our relationship, but you're still planning on being with someone else?" Linda was quick to clarify, "It's not exactly like that. There's someone I've met, and I want to have a physical relationship with him. It wouldn't be all the time, just here and there, and I promise to be completely honest about it. I truly believe our love is strong enough that this won't change how I feel about you. If you love me as much as you say, you'll understand this is something I need." She said it with a calm confidence, as if she was explaining something perfectly reasonable. Still reeling, I asked, "How do you figure this wouldn't affect us? And have you already made plans with him?" Without missing a beat, she confirmed, "We're tentatively planning a weekend getaway next week." Then, as if to test me, she asked, "How would you react if the roles were reversed?" I knew my answer might sting, but I gave it anyway. "I'd be okay with it, as long as you could assure me it wouldn't change anything between us." Linda wasn't buying it. "Come on, you know that's not true. You'd lose your mind if I ever suggested this." I couldn't help but scoff at her assumption, and she seemed taken aback by my reaction. "I didn't expect this from you," she said, sounding almost disappointed. "I thought your love for me would be enough to make you accept this." I stared at her in disbelief. "I don't know what you've been imagining," I said, "but it's definitely not realistic. Do you honestly think I'd just stand by and let you have an affair? Am I supposed to just sit here while you spend the weekend with another man?" For the first time, she hesitated. "Maybe I didn't think this all the way through," she admitted, looking down. "You're right, I didn't take everything into account, including my own feelings. But if I say no now, will you still go through with it?" She looked me straight in the eyes and said quietly, "I'm not sure. I didn't think you'd actually say no." It was clear that neither of us had thought this through. "How about this?" she suggested. "Let's give it a few days. I need some time to think things over, and then we can sit down and talk again on Sunday." Tonight threw me off too. Feeling unsettled, I decided I couldn't share a bed with her, not after everything she'd just said. I started gathering my things to move into the guest room. Linda noticed and asked what I was doing. "I don't feel like sleeping next to someone who's more focused on another man than on me," I told her flatly. I closed the guest room door a little harder than I intended, feeling a mixture of anger and confusion. That night was long and sleepless, but it gave me time to think, to come up with a plan. I realized that if Linda followed through with her plan, there'd be no saving our relationship. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but we didn't speak. Once I got to the office, I called in and explained that I needed a couple of days off for personal reasons. Then, I set my plan into motion. First, I went out and bought 3 voice-activated recorders. I placed one near the phone, one in our bedroom, and one in her car. I even set up a phone tap to record any calls made from the landline. After that, I went to our cell phone provider. Since I was the one who managed her account, it was easy to get a full list of her phone records. While she was still at work, I decided to dig into her emails. I found one account I didn't know existed, but guessing the password wasn't hard. What I found inside made my stomach drop, but at least I discovered that she hadn't slept with him yet. I set the email account to forward any new messages to me without leaving a trace behind. I wasn't done yet. I bought 2 small GPS trackers, easy to hide and nearly impossible to detect. One would go in her wallet, where she always kept her cash and cards, and the other would go in her car. By the end of the day, I had everything in place to track her movements. All that was left was getting access to her phone to check her messages, which I planned to do later that night, along with planting the GPS devices. When I checked her emails again, I saw she had exchanged a flurry of messages with a coworker named Frank Jones. So, Frank was the one at the center of all this. I was ready to tear his world apart, just like he'd done to mine. The emails confirmed that their weekend plans were a go, no matter what I had to say. That Friday, I went straight to a divorce lawyer I'd heard good things about. I told him to start the process, citing adultery as the reason, and made sure Frank Jones was named as the other man. The lawyer assured me it would be a simple case, as long as I had solid proof. I handed over the emails, phone records, and mentioned that I'd soon have recordings to back it all up. He seemed satisfied and promised to get started immediately. When Linda came home that evening, I gave her the cold shoulder. Not a word passed between us as she busied herself with preparing dinner. Instead of sticking around, I grabbed my keys and headed out to a bar to eat and have a couple of beers. When I got back, she tried to start a conversation, but I walked right past her, went into the guest room, and slammed the door behind me. At this point, the only way she could save our marriage was to call off her plans with Frank, but I wasn't holding my breath. I ignored her for the entire weekend. By Sunday afternoon, though, I figured it was time to talk. We both sat down in the kitchen, and I decided to lay it all out. I told her I had spent the past few days thinking long and hard about her request, and no matter how I looked at it, I couldn't see a way to be okay with it. I reminded her that even though she claimed it wouldn't affect our marriage, it was already tearing us apart. I pointed out the tension between us and suggested that maybe if she had put herself in my shoes, she'd understand why this wasn't something I could accept. I've tried to see it from your perspective, I said, but no matter how I turn it around, there's nothing good that could come of it. So, I'm going to have to say no. Her response was sharp: "How can you be so selfish? If you love me, why can't you let me have this?" I couldn't believe she was flipping it on me like that. Selfish? I shot back. I think it's pretty selfish of you to want to be with someone else when we've built a life together. And what if I go through with it anyway? She challenged, staring me down. There will be consequences, I warned. We took vows 10 years ago, to be faithful to each other. I know, but this is something I need to do, she insisted. At that point, I knew the conversation was over. Well, I guess we're done here then. You really need to think hard about this. I stood up, grabbed my laptop, and walked out of the house. I needed some space, so I found a nearby spot where I could keep tabs on their emails without her hovering around. Linda was furious. I watched her send Frank an email, assuring him that she was definitely going, no matter what I said. Frank seemed just as eager, replying that he had already booked room 125 at the Hilton in Kansas City for Friday and Saturday night. As soon as I read that, I made my own move and reserved that exact room for Thursday night. They were making this all too easy. In their messages, they discussed plans for a romantic Saturday night, complete with dinner, dancing, and some time alone. Linda even mentioned buying new underwear just for the occasion. I sat there, grabbing a bite to eat while keeping an eye on their back and forth. They had moved on from my refusal, fully diving into planning their weekend. Check-in was at 3 p.m., and Frank was set to pick her up at 1 since it was a 2-hour drive. I was surprised he'd be picking her up right from our house. I needed to figure out how I wanted to handle that. To make things even more airtight, I reserved a room close to theirs so I could intercept all their signals. Over the next few days, I got all the equipment I needed, including a couple of discrete HD fiber optic video cameras. My plan was to set them up in their room on Thursday, so everything would be ready to document their affair. It was the perfect evidence for my divorce case. The whole time, I continued giving Linda the silent treatment. Then Wednesday arrived, her day of reckoning. I decided to give her one final opportunity to back out. I asked her to sit down at the table with me for a moment. She wasn't exactly thrilled, but she complied. I started by asking if she had thought things over any more. She confirmed that she had, and with a steady voice, she told me she was going ahead with her plan. She talked about the upcoming trip with Frank and how she hoped we could move past it. I let out a long sigh and gave her one last warning, telling her this was her final chance to reconsider. I urged her not to throw away our marriage for some fling and cautioned her about the consequences she'd face if she didn't change her mind. But she stood firm. Nothing I said could sway her. I ended the conversation bluntly, saying, "So, you've chosen Frank over me." The decision had been made. I walked out of the room and, as usual, slammed the door behind me. It was clear now that our marriage was over, and someone was going to have to face the fallout. Thursday morning, I went to work and requested the afternoon off, along with Friday, to finalize the divorce process with Linda. My boss was sympathetic, offering his full support and giving me the time off without question. I drove to Kansas City that afternoon, checked into the room Linda and Frank would be using, and installed all the surveillance gear, making sure everything was perfectly positioned and working. I tested the cameras to ensure they'd capture everything. Once everything was set up, I walked down the hall past their room to confirm I was within range to monitor everything. When I got home that night, the reality of the situation hit me hard. My marriage was done. But I had one more stop to make. I headed to a nearby store and picked up a small can of pepper spray, planning to use it to throw a wrench in their romantic evening. When I got home, Linda was sitting in the kitchen, looking at me expectantly, as if waiting for something. I walked past Linda without saying a word, slamming the door behind me just like I had before. She followed me into the room, trying to act friendly, but I wasn't having it. "Save that for Frank," I told her, "I don't need your pity." I turned my back to her, and she left. That night, I barely slept, but I knew everything was in place to bring this to an end. Friday morning, I got up, left the house at my usual time, and didn't say a single word to her. I headed straight to my lawyer's office and signed the divorce papers. I informed them I'd have all the evidence they needed by Monday and asked that the papers be served to Linda at her workplace Monday afternoon. I also made sure that Frank would be served at the same time, as I planned to sue him for alienation of affection. When I checked Linda's GPS, I saw she was at the hair salon, so I took my chance. I went home, opened her suitcase, and found the new lingerie she had bought. It was undeniably sexy, but it stung knowing she wasn't wearing it for me. With rubber gloves on, I took out the underwear and sprayed the crotch of her panties and the cups of her bra with pepper spray. Once they were back in the suitcase, I couldn't help but smile. This was going to be interesting. After that, I headed to the bank and closed all our joint accounts, moving the money into a new one under my name. I canceled every credit card we shared as well. With that done, I went back home, ready to say goodbye to my soon-to-be ex-wife. It was around 12:30 when I got home, and I knew she'd be getting ready for her big weekend with Frank. Linda wasn't downstairs, so I headed up to the bedroom and found her putting on some lingerie I'd bought her in the past. She looked embarrassed and tried to cover up, but I stopped her, saying, "Don't bother, I've seen it all before." To be honest, she looked stunning, her new hairstyle, flawless makeup, and that enticing lingerie. I couldn't help but tell her, "You look incredible today. It's just a shame you never put this much effort in for me." She looked down, explaining that she just wanted to feel good about herself. "Well, you do," I admitted, "but it seems like you're more worried about impressing him than you ever were about me." She apologized, saying she only wanted to feel attractive. I sighed, reminding her that she had always been beautiful to me. I've always loved you, and I thought you loved me too, I said softly, as I reached out and slipped the wedding rings from her left hand. I told her, these rings, especially the one I gave you on our wedding day, they meant something to me. They symbolized our promise to forsake everyone else. I paused and continued, but clearly, that promise means a lot less to you now. I explained that I didn't want to see her wearing my ring while she was with another man. I also reminded her that the engagement ring had belonged to my mother and that I planned to keep it for sentimental reasons. Linda looked shocked but didn't say a word as I pocketed the rings. I won't be here when Frank arrives, I told her calmly, but don't let him step foot in my house. If you do, I promise I'll make sure neither of you will ever forget it. She asked what I meant, but I was clear. He's not welcome here, Linda. Do you understand? Yes, she replied. I won't let him inside. Good, I said, because I'll be watching. She looked at me, hurt in her eyes, and asked, why are you acting like this? I replied, because the love of my life just threw away everything we had. I sighed, turned on my heel, and walked out, leaving her standing there. As I left the house, she yelled after me, but I was done listening. I parked a few blocks away, just out of sight but close enough to see if Frank showed up. If he dared to walk into that house, I was ready to risk jail, but they'd both regret it more than I would. Soon enough, his car pulled up. I watched as he walked to the door, rang the bell, and Linda stepped out with her suitcase in hand. They hugged, and the two shared a long, passionate kiss. He picked up her suitcase, and as they turned to leave, Linda glanced in my direction, a smug grin on her face. When they got into the car, she shot me another cocky look. I didn't hesitate to flip her off as they drove by, wiping that grin off her face. After they were gone, I headed back home. I changed all the locks and the garage door code, then grabbed the suitcase I had already packed and made my way to Kansas City. Once I checked into the hotel, I went straight to the room and set up my laptop. The camera I had installed earlier was perfectly aimed at the foot of the bed, and soon enough, there was Linda, making her move. It was clear they had already been intimate, though it didn't look like Frank had lasted very long. He came out of the bathroom completely naked, and I couldn't help but laugh at what I saw. The guy was embarrassingly small compared to what Linda was used to. I watched as Frank crawled back into bed, ready for another round. Linda smiled at him and opened her arms, but I laughed again when she reached down for his tiny little tool. He didn't have to hold back, there was no way she could even feel that thing inside her. Wow, I thought, she really made a poor choice. This guy was beyond pathetic. I could see the frustration building on Linda's face as he took yet another break. It was becoming clear she wasn't going to be satisfied with how this weekend was shaping up. She'd leave here disappointed, come back home for one last night, and by the next day, she'd be out of my life for good. The guy managed to rally for another round, but it was just another lackluster 4-minute session. He'd hit the finish line 3 times already, and she wasn't even close. Honestly, this was turning out better than I had imagined. I couldn't stomach watching any more, though, so I left everything recording and headed out for dinner and a couple of drinks. Every second of their dull affair would be captured, evidence I could hand over to the lawyer, and proof of just how bad a decision Linda had made. When I came back, Frank was passed out, and Linda was sitting there, still clearly annoyed. What had started out painful was quickly becoming entertaining. That night, I lay in bed thinking about what kind of fun I'd have messing with Frank tomorrow. I even caught myself thinking about the women I'd seen at the bar earlier. Soon enough, I'd be free to pursue them, no strings attached. With that thought in mind, I drifted off to sleep, smiling for the first time in a while. The pain was gone. I knew exactly where I was headed. The next morning, I woke up feeling ready for the day. After a quick shower, I grabbed breakfast and some snacks to keep on hand. Then, I had an idea. I called up a local florist and ordered a bouquet for Linda, the same kind I used to send her on our anniversaries. Since this was going to be the last anniversary gift she'd ever get from me, I wanted her to think about what she was about to throw away. I scheduled the delivery for 11 a.m., just as things were probably getting heated between her and Frank. It turned out I had timed it perfectly. They had left the room for a while, but when they came back, the action started up again. They hadn't been at it long when there was a knock at the door. The flowers had arrived right on cue. I watched as Linda's face shifted from surprise to irritation. She grabbed her phone and immediately called me. My phone rang, and I answered with a smirk. "Hello. Did you send me flowers?" she asked, already sounding upset. "Oh, you got them. Well, it hasn't exactly been a great day for me either. My wife's off with some other guy, and here I am, trying not to lose my mind." I kept my voice calm, casual, as if nothing was wrong. "Why do you even care?" "Because," she snapped, "they're the exact same flowers you always send me for our anniversaries." I couldn't help but laugh. "And you think I did that?" "Let me tell you, sweetheart, if I had sent those flowers, they wouldn't have been roses. They'd have been ragweed, and the card would have said, 'To my cheating wife.' But hey, maybe these will remind you of what you're about to lose." There was a stunned silence on the other end before I hung up. She tried calling me back several times, but I didn't bother answering. Eventually, she gave up. I saw her talking to Frank about it, and he tried to reassure her that I'd come around eventually. He couldn't have been more wrong. Linda wasn't in the mood after our brief exchange, but it didn't take long before she started giving in to him again. That's when I had another idea. I picked up the phone and ordered her favorite pizza, the one I knew she couldn't resist. The pizza arrived just as Frank was getting back into the swing of things. He wasn't happy about the interruption and tried to refuse it, but the delivery guy insisted, even confirming the room number and Frank's phone number. The poor guy had no choice but to pay up, or the delivery driver was ready to call the cops. After the pizza guy left, they decided they might as well eat, since it was already paid for. After their meal, they talked for a bit, but Frank couldn't hold back much longer. Soon enough, he was back to chasing Linda around the room. That's when I ordered her favorite sandwich from a nearby deli, just to keep the fun going. A couple of minutes into their activities, the knock came. This time, it was the sandwich. Linda's face dropped when she saw it, and she finally realized I knew exactly where they were. Frank, of course, couldn't believe it, but Linda started piecing things together. She figured I had hacked into her email and tracked them down. She told him I was good at that kind of thing, and it wouldn't have taken much for me to figure it out. At this point, they decided to get dressed and go out for a while, planning to return later in the evening. Linda promised Frank she'd make it up to him tonight. As they left, I was laughing so hard I had tears rolling down my face. When they got back later, they showered, dressed up, and Linda even put on some lingerie, giving Frank a little show. He tried to make his move again, but she insisted they head out for their big date. I couldn't wait for the next part of my plan to kick in. Linda had no idea what was coming. As they left the hotel room, looking like the picture of a romantic couple, I settled in, waiting eagerly for their return. I knew things were about to get very interesting. About an hour after their date, they returned to the hotel, and Linda wasted no time rushing into the bathroom. She hopped in the shower and stayed there much longer than usual. When she finally came out, her breasts and crotch were bright red, and it was clear they looked painfully irritated. It seemed poor Frankie wasn't going to be getting any action that night either. Linda collapsed on the bed, groaning in discomfort, and when Frankie tried to get frisky, she snapped at him, saying she was in too much pain and not in the mood. She chalked it up to an allergic reaction from her new lingerie. Little did she know that I had made sure of that reaction. While she was busy dealing with her reaction, I spent the evening organizing all my video footage, putting together DVDs for my lawyer and Frankie's wife. By the time everything was ready, I called it a night. It had been a wildly successful day, and I couldn't help but smile as I thought about the trouble I'd stirred up in their little paradise. And the best part? I was just getting started. Sunday morning, I packed up and headed home. I knew Linda was in for a rude awakening when she got back, but I wasn't going to rush it. When Frankie dropped her off later that afternoon, he didn't even bother walking her to the door. He just let her out like a delivery. I was sitting on the couch, deep into a football game, and didn't even acknowledge her as she announced her return. She stood in front of the TV, blocking my view, flashing me a sultry smile. "I figured you'd be happy to see me, you know, since I'm not dead," she teased, trying to act cute. Without taking my eyes off the screen, I responded, "What gave you that impression? You think I've suddenly turned stupid?" She shifted her tone, explaining, "I don't think you're stupid. I just thought your love for me was strong enough to move past this." I finally looked at her, and said flatly, "I did love you, but that all changed when you walked out with another man," ignoring everything I said. "I poured my heart out to you, and it meant nothing." Linda seemed genuinely shocked by my response. "I can't believe you feel that way about me," she muttered. "Believe it," I replied firmly. "You made a massive mistake." She softened, asking if there was any chance for us to move forward, promising she'd do anything to fix things. I gave her a sarcastic smirk. "Anything? How about you drop to your knees and apologize right now?" She scoffed at the suggestion. "I can't do that." I sighed. "I knew you wouldn't. Just like how you couldn't keep your promises when we got married. You said you'd be faithful, and look where we are." Linda shifted uncomfortably, saying she'd been thinking about me all day and that she wanted to make love tonight. I coldly responded, "You need me?" "Funny. I'm not interested." "Did you and little Frankie use protection every time you were together?" Her eyes widened. "No, I mean, he's married. I can't have kids." I wasn't buying it. "Do you honestly think you're the only one he's been raw with? As far as I'm concerned, you're damaged goods. I won't touch you until you've got a clean bill of health from a doctor." She snapped back, "You can use protection if you don't trust me." I chuckled bitterly. "Right, I'm supposed to wear a condom to sleep with my own wife after she's spent a weekend raw-dogging some loser? You've got to be kidding me. You picked Frankie over me, so screw you. I'm going out. I can't stand looking at your cheating face tonight. You can sleep in the guest room. I'll take the master bedroom, since I didn't do anything wrong." Linda's voice hardened as she stood her ground. "We can talk about this tomorrow after work." I shook my head. "I'm not sure there's anything left to discuss." I walked out, heading to a nearby bar and grill to grab dinner. I wasn't much of a drinker, but I needed to clear my head, even though, in truth, my head was already clear. I knew exactly what I was doing, I just needed some distance from her. After grabbing a meal and taking a long walk, I returned home, only to find her lying in my bed. I gave her a stern look. "Get out." She argued, "This is our bed. I have just as much right to it as you do." I snapped, "The hell you do. You gave up that right when you slept with Frankie. Get out of my bed, or I'll toss you and your stuff onto the street." She started crying, but I didn't flinch. She slowly got up and left the room, sobbing as she walked down the hallway. I made sure to lock the door behind her. The next morning, I ignored her completely. We both had breakfast, and she left for work at her usual time. Before she walked out the door, she paused and said, "I love you." I shot her a cold, scornful look. "I loved you too." Past tense. I watched her tear up as she turned and left. The second she was gone, I started packing her belongings into garbage bags. Then, I reached out to Frankie's wife. I asked if she knew her husband had spent the weekend with my wife. She told me she believed he'd been on a business trip. I offered to share my evidence with her, and she was eager to take me up on it. When I arrived at her door, I was taken aback. She was absolutely stunning. I stammered for a moment when Frankie's wife opened the door, caught off guard by her beauty. I quickly apologized, blaming my initial reaction on her looks, which was entirely honest. Once I regained my composure, I got down to business and explained everything that had gone on over the weekend. She was furious with Frankie, and we agreed that she'd come with me to my lawyer's office to see if he'd take her case. The lawyer agreed to represent her and even offered a discount. While she began filling out the paperwork, I had a quick chat with the attorney. I asked if I needed to wait before serving Frankie to protect her, but he assured me that as long as she signed the papers first, she'd be in the clear. After the paperwork was done, we went out for lunch while they finalized her divorce papers. Once she signed everything, I dropped her off at home and headed back, waiting for Linda to call. I knew she'd be in for a shock when she found out what was coming. Sure enough, my phone rang around 3 p.m., and Linda sounded upset. "What the hell is this?" she demanded. "I just got served with divorce papers, and Frank's been hit with some lawsuit about alienation of affection." I replied calmly, "It's all pretty straightforward, isn't it? I warned you there'd be consequences, but it seems like you didn't believe me." "I didn't think you'd actually go through with this," she shot back. I couldn't help but smirk. "Well, maybe you should have listened to me instead of buying into whatever nonsense Frankie was selling you. But look, let's not hash this out over the phone. We can talk when you get here." After hanging up, I gathered her belongings, stuffed them into garbage bags, and tossed them into the front yard. I had everything set up to record what was about to go down, just in case I needed the footage for a restraining order. When she pulled into the driveway and saw her things strewn across the lawn, she lost it. She was screaming incoherently, spit flying from her mouth as she hurled insults. I stayed calm, watching her meltdown until she finally started to break down. "If you want to talk, settle down so we can have a civilized conversation," I told her. "If not, I'll pack your stuff into your car and you can leave." Through sobs, she cried out, "I never thought you'd actually do this to me." I looked at her, unflinching. "Do this to you? You did this to us, Linda. I told you over and over not to go through with it, and you chose to wreck our marriage anyway. What made you think I wouldn't file for divorce? You said you loved me," she whimpered. "I did," I replied firmly. "I loved you more than anything. But you shattered my heart. The real problem is, you never loved or respected me, and I can't stay with someone who thinks so little of me. Even though I still have feelings for you." Linda asked, almost hesitantly, "Why do you keep calling him Little Frankie?" I let out a humorless laugh. "I had cameras set up in your room all weekend. I saw everything, and let's just say, he's not exactly well equipped. First time I saw what he's working with, I laughed so hard I almost cried. I even wondered if you could feel anything at all." Her face flushed with embarrassment. "We made love," she said quietly, "and I'll miss that." I wasn't about to let her play the victim. "Look, Linda, now you've got the freedom to be with whoever you want. You can have a new guy every night if that's what you're after." She shook her head. "I don't want anyone else. I want you." Sighing, I said, "Let's sit inside for a minute." We went to the kitchen and sat down at the table, just like we had done so many times before. But this time, it hit me hard, this would be the last time we'd sit here together. She looked at me and asked softly, "You wouldn't actually hurt Frank, would you?" I stared at her. "Why not? He ruined our marriage, and I think he should pay for that, beyond just a lawsuit and his divorce." She looked puzzled. "Wait, he's not getting a divorce, is he?" "He is now," I told her. "His wife understands the situation and is ready to end it. In fact, they're even sharing a lawyer, and we got a discount." Linda looked doubtful. "You really believe that, or is this just some trick to make me look bad?" I shook my head. "I talked to his wife this morning. I showed her all the evidence. Frank had told her he was on a business trip. Now they're both done. She sat there quietly for a moment, reflecting. I wish you'd been honest with me when I asked how you'd react if I wanted to be with another man. I knew you'd go crazy. I laughed, a bitter sound. That's the thing. I don't think you believe me, even now, and that's one of the reasons we're getting divorced. Honestly, I don't care anymore. When you call him later, you'll find out that he's been kicked to the curb just like you. So, you're really kicking me out? She asked, her voice small. Yes, Linda. I decided the night you told me about your plan. I went into the guest room to think, and within an hour, I knew I wanted a divorce. On Thursday, I bought everything I needed to gather evidence and hack into your email. By Friday, I had already visited the lawyer and set the divorce process in motion. Linda, sensing her world crumbling, asked me, why didn't you give me a heads up that you were planning to divorce me? Maybe I would have reconsidered. Is there any way you could forgive me? I paused, feeling the weight of the moment. Linda, I loved you more than anything, and there might have been a chance for forgiveness, but that opportunity passed last night. You let it slip right through your fingers. I sighed, looking away for a moment. Even if I could forgive you, I'd never be able to trust you again. I'd spend every day wondering when you'd want to be with someone else. And I can't live like that. Tears welled up in her eyes, and I continued, firm but calm. Unlike you, I've given this a lot of thought, and no matter how much I turn it over in my head, I always reach the same conclusion: I'm going to divorce you. And I'm going to make sure little Frankie pays for wrecking our marriage. I could see the reality of the situation finally sinking in. You can call him if you want, figure out where you're going to stay, but don't bother using your credit cards. I've cancelled them. I left half the money in our checking account for you, and I've removed my name from it. I'll split our savings, and you can keep your car, but you'll need to manage the payments yourself. Take your clothes, personal things, whatever you need. I'll even let you have some furniture once you find a place to live. But the house? That's mine. If I sell it, I'll give you half, but everything's outlined in the divorce papers. If you choose to contest it, I'll use the evidence I've gathered, and it won't end well for you. She nodded, her voice trembling. I won't fight it. This is all my fault. I just wish I could undo it. I tried to lighten the mood, though humor felt distant. You know the difference between a cheating wife and a light bulb? She looked confused. No, what's the difference? She asked. You can't have a romantic relationship with a light bulb, I quipped, but her expression stayed flat. This wasn't a joke she could laugh at. She shook her head slightly, resigned. I'm not going to argue, she said softly. I know it's all on me. I just wish I could turn back time. Realizing we were done, I told her it was time for her to go. I helped her gather the last of her things, packing everything into her car while she stood there, tears in her eyes. When everything was loaded up, I handed her one final item, her wedding ring. I had flattened it with a hammer, turning it into a meaningless piece of scrap metal. You can sell it for cash, I said bluntly, watching the emotion flicker across her face. Then, I leaned in, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Goodbye, my love." I turned and walked back into the house without looking back. Subscribe and stay one step ahead of cheaters. And trust me, the next story makes this one look like a fairy tale.